What is good, Tesla family? It's Ray J back with another video, and in this one I want to break down what's going on with Tesla, SPY, Nvda, the QQQ, and a couple of other tickers. I'm going to break down what's happening with the whole situation involving Israel and Iran, what's going on with more data affecting the markets, what the news is saying about Tesla, and what you should be watching for on the charts for Tesla, SPY, and all these different tickers. But before I begin the doubles information, before I get into any more details, let me just mention a couple of things. I am personally not a financial planner, so take nothing I say as financial advice. And also, if you guys can, please check out the Webull link, which is down below and in the description. If you sign up for Webull and deposit $500, you're guaranteed 20 free stocks. If you deposit $25,000 or more, you're guaranteed 75 of them. And the offer ends very soon in just about 2 weeks. So anyways, let's break down what's happening to Tesla. I just want to make it very clear that right now Tesla's on a big downtrend on the daily chart, and there's a risk of more downside when you look at the gap that's about to get filled most likely into the mid 140s. So yes, Tesla's looking a little bit weak from a technical standpoint. There's weakness in the market so far, but I still believe the market will bounce later on, maybe sometime next week, maybe sometime later on, after we come a little bit lower and see a bit more downside. So I want to break down more reasons about that. I'm going to talk about the charts and everything in just a couple of minutes, but let me first go over some very crucial data about the markets. So for tomorrow, it's going to be April 19th, 2024. Tomorrow is going to be Friday, and we have one Fed speaker at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Besides that, there's not really anything else coming out for the markets that's quite significant. Then we have more news coming out involving Iran and Israel. The situation is still very tense. We saw Iran do their retaliatory attacks over the weekend, and then since then Israel has been threatening to attack them back, but they've been saying that they may delay the attack. Now Iran is warning that it may revise its nuclear doctrine, and it threatens to hit Israeli nuclear sites. So once again, guys, I'm not pointing fingers or saying anything. I just want to say that both sides are threatening each other, and the situation is still very tense. That's all we have to worry about right now. It's a very, very tense situation, and this is still having a very negative effect on the markets. Why is that? Well, with the market dipping, it's because of many different factors. One of the reasons why the market has been dipping is because of what's been going on around the world. We have yields essentially going up. We have the bonds market affecting us, and we also are starting to see the treasury yield increase. On top of this, there is potential for crude to start going up. If we get more attacks, if Israel attacks Iran back, then Iran attacks back, and it goes back and forth and back and forth, crude will most definitely start going up, and this is going to cause inflation to spike, in my opinion, in the US markets. So if inflation starts going up, the Fed has to be a bit more hawkish, keep rates higher for longer. This is going to cause more pain for the economy, for earnings, and beyond. So that's something worth noting. It's very important for stocks like Tesla too. For more pieces of news, okay, we just had Netflix announce its earnings, and then for tomorrow, we have American Express and P&G. But going back to Netflix, the share price is down about 4.8% at the time I'm recording this because their guidance wasn't necessarily the best. And that's despite the fact that they had pretty good earnings overall. And let me elaborate on that. So their total memberships rose 16% in the quarter, reaching 270 million. That's above the 264 million that Wall Street had expected. This is going to be one of the last glimpses investors get of the company's subscriber base. And then on top of all of this, going down right here, you guys could see EPS was about $5.28 above expectations. Revenue was $9.37 billion above expectations. And the total memberships was at 269 million above expectations, which is not bad. Their first net income for the quarter is at about $2.33 billion, which is once again a lot better than what we saw previously, with revenue going up. So good earnings overall, but the share price ended up dropping because of this right here. Netflix noted that it expects net additions to be lower in the second quarter as well. Its second quarter revenue forecast is $9.49 billion, shy of Wall Street's estimate of $9.54 billion. So their guidance for revenue is weaker than expected. And that's not the best of news for the company. The share price is down because of that. It shows how important guidance tends to be. So I want to make that as clear as possible. That is why the share price of Netflix is down despite their earnings being decent. That's why things are falling the way they are. That's something very important and worth noting. I just want to call that out. Anyways, going back to the fear and greed index, right now the market is quite fearful. Market momentum is dipping a bit as we're approaching the 125 daily moving average, and the market's losing some greed, some strength so far. On top of this, the puts and call option positioning is going up as we're seeing more puts being bought, causing this to go up, and we're starting to see more shorts piling into the markets. Additionally, market volatility is also on an uptrend as the VIX is still dictating and instigating more fear amongst investors. And this is very important because it's showing the market is still on a strong downtrend. We're not officially reversing quite yet. The last thing I'm going to talk about before I break down some news about Tesla is the overall options chain for SPY. We have over 1.1 million of these calls expiring, and we have over 3 million puts expiring for tomorrow. That's very important. The put to call ratio is actually above 2.61. It should be higher than that, with max pain at 500. There is a chance the market makers may try to get us a little push at the end of the day tomorrow, back up to 500, but we might dip first before we get that. So I want to talk about that in just a few minutes. For Tesla, we have some news coming out that Elon Musk is shedding light on what happened with the Cybertruck accelerator issue. This is part of why Tesla is dipping, because the Cybertruck had an issue with its accelerator pad, and that has paused deliveries, at least for the time being. So this is very important. This has been making a lot of headlines, and with the pedal problem holding up the VINs, it's basically trying to fix this as time goes on. This is what like a lot of emails were saying about this. Now, with that happening, the reason why this happens is because, and this is what Elon Musk kind of clarified about this. He said that there were no injuries or accidents because of this. They just are trying to be very cautious, but they should be resuming very, very soon when it comes to their deliveries. So that's not the end of the world. What is affecting Tesla is the fact that we're seeing more layoffs. We saw over 100 more layoffs in just like the New York area, and we're starting to see more and more of them as Tesla's getting ready to lay off more than 10% of their entire workforce. And on top of all of that, there's more talk about how they're letting go of some important figures who are really, really key for the company, such as two important executives, excuse me. And then we also have other people, part of big departments, getting laid off. So it's a little bit negative for Tesla. Tesla also dipped on the news about the downgrade. We have more analysts from Deutsche Bank coming out, such as Emmanuel Rossner, who downgraded the stock to a hold from a buy rating. We also had some price cuts from other banks for Tesla, so that's part of why Tesla is down a little bit. That's why Tesla got this little dip as well. Volume is at 95.6 million, a little bit above average, so we dropped on a somewhat higher volume, and we closed below 150, which is a bad sign. Despite the short volume is dipping a bit. And then we have Baird, which gave Tesla a good rating. Barclays gave Tesla an equal weight rating, and the others out there are still very, very significant. So some analysts are saying Tesla will outperform a bit, others are saying it's going to perform equally. And we have some price cuts that came out. That's part of why Tesla has dipped. We have the price price ratio dipping a little bit. It's dropping all the way down here because Tesla is still weak compared to the market. It's still not in the best of places. And then we also have more volatility. For seasonality, we're only green about 49% of the time, and we tend to see more volatility at 10 a.m., 11 o'clock a.m., and then during the final hour of the trading day. And then besides that, that's all I'm really seeing in terms of all this data. So with that being said, with everything that's going on, let's now break down these charts and break down how things are looking in my personal opinion. So for Tesla, we're on a bit of a downtrend on the daily chart, and this is what it looks like right here. One thing worth noting is the fact that Tesla is continuing to fall, and we have this big gap over here. So I know it's a little hard to see on my daily chart. Let me zoom in a little bit more. So right here, if you look at the daily charts, so where you see these lines right over here, see these dotted lines, that's where Tesla currently is. We're halfway through filling this gap. I think we're going to most likely fill this gap very soon, all the way down to about 144. So I see a risk of a little bit more downside for Tesla before this thing tries to bounce with the markets. I just want to call that out. It's a pretty long-term gap. It's been there for over a year, almost a year and a half, actually. So that's very significant. Tesla has a gap all the way down to the mid 140s. We could be falling to fill that first. On SPY, on the daily chart, SPY has a gap as well. There's this gap over here at about 497. We also have support around 495, which is approaching the weekly 20 EMA. I think there's a risk of SPY dipping a little bit more to fill that gap before we get some kind of bounce, but we could bounce that 495 to about 497 area. Just wanted to call that out. Aapl, let me call out something important about Aapl. When you look at Apple's chart, okay, we're approaching this support at 165 to 166. The last time we hit this, we tend to bounce, and we do like to bounce off this. So I wouldn't be surprised if we dip a little bit more towards 166 to 165. But then we could see buyers try to defend us here, because the last time this happened, buyers did defend us. So we will see what happens at this critical support. We also have previous resistance becoming support at 166. So that is a key level on Aapl. We'll see if that bounces there or not. We could dip a little bit more, but then a bounce could come. We look bearish on the daily chart for the QQQ, by the way. We have this other little gap here. This was filled previously, but this was like a previous zone that's very important. Basically, we have 421 to 420 as a very, very key zone. Around that area, we do tend to see the QQQ bounce a little bit. If we lose 420, we could sink all the way down to this next support over here at like 416. I don't think it's going to dip that low before it gets to bounce. We could actually be approaching 420 before we get it. So I'm going to be watching that level as well on the QQQ. All right, so that is it for the daily charts analysis. We're going to switch over to smaller time frames now and break down our key levels to be watching for, especially going into tomorrow as we have another trading day. So for tomorrow, there's not really a whole lot of data coming up. But let me just note that the news will affect Tesla, and so far the chart is showing a little bit of weakness. So with that being said, let's talk about these levels. What levels should we be watching for on Tesla? So we have resistance at 150. And then if we break that, watch 151.5. If it breaks through this, we could be trying to push up for the highs of the day today. And if that breaks, we have 154 coming. If we lose support at 149, we're going to be looking for a dip all the way down towards our gap fill. If 149 fails on Tesla, look for that gap fill all the way down to the mid 140s. We could be approaching this 145 zone. So I see another risk of more downside if Tesla ends up losing support. And we could be falling all the way down here to where 145 is, around that area. I'm going to make this blue and a little bit more bold just to show you guys where that line happens to be. So in my opinion, the share price could kind of pop in the morning, retest 150 or something a little bit higher, and then start dipping again. If we get bad news, we could be falling all the way down to fill this gap at 145 and then try to bounce from here. I think the market's going to bounce soon, but we might dip a little bit more first before we get that bounce. So we might see Tesla kind of dip a bit more before we end up getting some kind of bounce. And there is a risk of it coming down to fill this gap all the way down here before that bounce comes. I want to give you guys a warning about this. We have a bearish wedge forming on Tesla. Might dip a little bit more before we get that bounce. So watch for that as we approach that gap fill. And we have to basically lose 149 for confirmation. So far, the chart's looking very weak and there is a risk of that happening. So watch for that on Tesla very, very carefully. On top of that, for SPY has resistance at 500, 501, which is where our 20 EMA happens to be, 503, and 505. We have support at 499. If we lose that, a bigger dip is coming all the way down to 497 to fill the gap. If not, 495. That's where our next support is going to be. In my personal opinion, it might try to retest this 20 EMA, hit 500 point something, then reject again tomorrow and start dipping down to fill this gap at 497 or so to 495. And if max pain is still at 500, we might actually bounce back up and close to 500. But I still see a risk of us kind of dipping back down here to fill the gap and then bounce. And then we could form kind of like a doji on the dealer or something like that and then try to reverse next week. But I feel like we might come down to fill this gap, so there might be a little bit more downside that comes before we get some kind of bounce. That is something worth noting. On the QQQ, it's the same thing. Essentially, we have resistance. We like to reject off our 20 EMA. Notice how it did this about 3-4 times already. So I wouldn't be surprised if we kind of pop a bit tomorrow, retest 425, then reject and start dipping again. And we could be retesting 422, if not this 421 to 420 zone. So we might kind of like pop a bit, then drop, and then retest the support in the 421 to 420 area, and then try to rebound after that. That's worth noting on the QQQ. So we'll be watching to see if that ends up being the case. On top of all of this, we have Nvda. Nvidia is looking a little bit weak. We have a double top leg structure. Could pop a bit and start dipping all the way down towards 838 and then 834. Might dip a little bit more from here, then try to rebound. So we'll have to see if that ends up being the case. And if that's the case, we could see a little rebound. But I think it might come back down a little bit lower. Maybe the QQQ drops with this, then we might get a rebound later on. Maybe at the end of the day, tomorrow or next week, the rebound might come. But we might dip first before we get that bounce. So watch for that on Nvidia. There could be a little bit more downside coming before the move comes. For Aapl, watch resistance at 167.7 and then 169 and then 170.5 above that. Watch support at 166 flat, followed by 165. That's going to be our key zone for Aapl. I think I wouldn't be surprised if Aapl kind of like pops a bit to this resistance, then rejects and dips this 165 to 166 area, then it tries to bounce after that. We'll be watching to see if that ends up being the case, but that is what is key so far for the chart. In my opinion, there is a risk of Aapl dipping a bit more, so we'll see if it ends up hitting the support and we bounce. That's going to be key. I think there is a risk of that happening. All right, so with that being said, the market also likes to dictate Tesla. Notice how the market kind of rebounded in the morning. Tesla was following it. Then the market dipped and Tesla followed the trend as well. So for tomorrow, If the market dips lower, this could drag Tesla down too. Might come down to fill the gap before we get that bounce, so watch for that very, very carefully. With that being said, guys, that is it for the main five. Let's talk about the other tickers I typically talk about as well. So I'm going to be a little bit more brief with this part, but let me just note that in my video from yesterday, I was talking about Palantir kind of dipping to that 21 area. That's exactly what happened so far, and I see a risk of that happening a little bit more. So I think that we could kind of retest 120. I'm sorry, 21.25, not 120, 21.25, then start sinking down to this wick. We could come down to about 20 point. This is about 20.7 to 20.5, then rebound after that. So look for a little bit more downside before an attempt to bounce. For super micro, looking a little bit bearish on the 4-hour time frame. Might retest 940 in the pre-market, then reject and start sinking all the way down to our 20 or 200 EMA, all the way down to 887, if not 900. So I look for a little pop and drop and then a retest of this support before it tries to bounce. So a little bit more downside is very probable on super micro. For Rivian, we have this resistance approaching at 8.98. Could come down a little bit at first, retest 8.5, and then try to continue to push higher. But this does look like it could try to bounce a little bit later on. I think that it may dip first before it tries to break out. So watch for that on Rivian. It has a little bit of strength building. For SoFi, SoFi has a nice little structure right over here. Might come towards 7 again, 7 to 7.07, then try to bounce. It's trying to base at 7. So look for a little dip after we got this big red bar. Might retest 7 and try to bounce back up to 7.2. So watch for that very carefully. For the IWM Russell 2000, this is bearish so far, but notice that historically it likes to bounce off 190. So it could kind of pop a bit, retest 194, and then dip down towards 190 or very close to that area. And I think we're going to be building support close to 190 to 192 around this range. Then we're going to be looking for a nice bounce after that. So look for a little pop and drop, a push to 190, then a bounce, and we'll see how things go from here. For AMD, in my opinion, is also kind of shifting as well. It's actually trying to base. Give me 1 second, guys. I think my Wi-Fi just froze. But if anything, I just wanted to say that for how things are moving, we have to be very, very patient, at least for the time being. All right. So, anyways, for AMD, sorry about that, guys. A little issue for 1 second. AMD likes to test our 20 EMA at 160. It is looking like it might dip a little bit, might retest 152. If we lose that, we could get closer to 150, but I think it's going to try to rebound back up to 160 very soon. So it might dip a bit and then try to rebound to 160. And we'll have to see if that ends up being the case. For ARM, we're still looking kind of bearish right now for the overall trend. We're going to be looking at 100 as our support. And if 100 fails us, excuse me, we could be looking for a move all the way down towards 91. So I do see a risk of more downside on ARM, but watch 100. It's going to likely test that. Let's see if it bounces or not off of that. For Coinbase, we might retest this trend line. So look for a little pop towards 220, then a dip all the way down to about 212. And if that fills us, we could dip a little bit more before we try to make our way back up. But watch and see if we continue this move. With a little uptrend being respected, it might pop and drop and retest the trend line before it tries to bounce. But I think that it may dip a little bit before we try to make our way back up to this imbalance. So I think that Coinbase is going to bounce, but it might dip a bit first before we get that move. For Amazon, we're still looking kind of bearish right now, losing support. It's going to be watch to see if it holds 179. If that fails, let's look for 178 around that area. Might dip a little bit more, and let's see if we bounce off that range, but I see a little bit more downside potentially coming. I also want to note that we have this downward channel being respected on Amazon, so it might just continue to test this, at least for the time being. So this is where our support just lies, at least for now, and then we'll see what happens, at least moving forward for now. But with that being said, that's what I'm seeing. We're still on a bit of a downtrend so far. It might kind of pop and then continue to downtrend a bit until we officially get a break. It's still kind of downtrending. Same thing on Meta. We have this downtrend as well. We're kind of rejecting right here. Might retest this resistance and come back down lower for one more attempt down. And we'll have to break this trend line for us to turn back to bullish. We haven't done so yet. It's kind of forming like a flag. So I'll be watching to see if that ends up happening to Meta. Still waiting to see if that happens. But overall, let me just note one more thing. Meta is still on a downtrend, so it could kind of pop and then start rejecting, coming back down to about 495, maybe a little bit lower, and we'll have to see if we can try to break out or not. We failed so far to do so. On Microsoft, you have a bit of a downtrend right now. We might pop a bit towards 405, then reject and come back down towards 401. If that fails us, I wouldn't be surprised if we come all the way down to 401 to 400. Then we try to bounce off that. The last time we hit this 400 area, it's about 401. We did see this thing rebound, so it might do the same thing again. For Google, Google is kind of shifting a little bit. We're kind of rejecting off our 20 EMA. It might dip towards 156, then try to bounce again. I think it's going to fill this imbalance and push to 160 soon, but it might dip first before we get that move. So watch for that. On the VIX, we're still on an uptrend. It hasn't really dipped yet. Watch and see if we end up losing 17.73. If we lose that, look for a dip towards 16.6. I think it might push a little bit higher because the market might come down a bit, causing that to happen. And then later on, the VIX might dip a little lower because of the market potentially bouncing soon. So I still hold that same view. The VIX will kind of pop first, then drop later. And I think that the market may drop and then eventually get a little rebound. The 10-year Treasury yield is still pushing because of what the Fed speakers have been saying. Look at resistance around this 4.7 area. We'll see what happens after that. We have support at 4.5. Might push up there, being bearish for the markets, then come back down if the market tries to bounce. The dollar, it's pushing. It's going to likely push a little bit higher towards 106.5. This would be bearish for the market for now, but once we're at this resistance, we'll see if this rejects or not and makes its way back down. So watch for that very, very carefully. With that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for listening. As of right now, we're on a bit of a downtrend in the markets. There is a risk of a bit more downside temporarily, but look for a little bit more downside, most likely as the most probable possibility before we see any kind of bounce. Tesla still has a risk of more downside, in my opinion. It's still barely holding 149. The trend is still bearish, so it might sink a little bit more towards the mid 140s before we try to get some kind of bounce, maybe next week as we approach earnings. But earnings will determine if we get a bigger bounce or not. That's going to be the real catalyst for Tesla. Otherwise, we might just get a little bit more downside before a small bounce later because of the overall market doing a technical move. All right, guys. So that is it for the video. Thank you all so much for listening. I'll see you guys tomorrow during the pre-market. Have a great end of the day. Enjoy your evening, and I'll see you guys very soon. Thanks again, guys, and peace out.